Mr. Harris, in 1928, Herbert Hoover was elected in a landslide victory. He's considered an American hero.
I remember that.
Can you explain that? Why he?
Well, the Republican Party was going big guns, and he was supposed to have a great war record, great engineer. I think I was one of those who were less enthusiastic than the majority. You want to know why?
Yeah.
Oh. The head of the health department at Harvard was a doctor, Dr. Alfred Worcester. And he was the head of the Red Cross in Switzerland during World War I. And he met and shook hands with every American prisoner who at the end of the war came out through Geneva. When the last prisoner was gone, he had thousands of tons of food, and he knew that there was hunger in Germany. And he cabled to Hoover, asking, as food administrator during the war, asking his permission to send in this food. It would not go to the army. He would see that it went to civilians. The reply was an order which was immediately carried out. All the food was loaded on flat cars, moved in the rail to a place where there was a high terrace, and dumped overboard to spoil. This, Alfred Worcester told me, I never forgot it. So I wasn't very enthusiastic about Mr. Hoover.
That's kind of second. Speed?
How did you first get news of the drought?
Well, of course, there was a farm depression developing even before the crash, and after the crash, of course. And so we just decided to go and take a look at it, both in the South and the Midwest. And that's what I was doing in that year, 1931.
When you were traveling around, did anything strike you about the South? Did anything make an impression on you?
Oh, sure. I saw poverty I'd never seen before in my life.
I tried to get it out in your question, but
That's the first time I've ever experienced that. A sneeze in the middle of an interview. Let me ask that question again. When you were traveling around, did anything impress you?
Very much. I never had seen such poverty as I encountered everywhere, particularly amongst rural sharecroppers, and of course, worst of all, amongst black croppers. And we made it a point to visit all types of people, landlords, sharecroppers, tenants, and I'll never forget what I saw. Perhaps I can illustrate it. Dr. Alexander, who was a well-known Southern person concerned with social affairs, described to us an incident near Macon, Georgia, where the gas company sent a man out to turn off the gas in a house where a woman and a number of children lived. And when he arrived, she was unable to pay the bill. She said, "Please give me time to finish cooking." He said, "No, my instructions are to turn it off right away." And she went into where she was cooking, and to his horror, he saw in a basket the head of a dog, and then realized that she was cooking a dog for the children as the only food she had in the house. He returned to the gas company, did not turn off the gas, reported this, and the head of the company, Macon, Georgia, drove out there, saw that it was true, gave the woman $10 and left. This was the kind of situation that existed in those days. not a bit exceptional.
Okay, let's cut for a second. So, could you tell me what's the national context for giving relief to a place like Arkansas?
Well, of course, there wasn't much in 1931. The Red Cross made statements that no one would go hungry, no one was going hungry, but they weren't very accurate. And very little was happening in the way of relief until some incidents took place in the South.
Now, Herbert Hoover had apparently solved the crisis in farming with the Federal Farm Board, hadn't he?
No, that was an emergency measure. It appropriated.
I'm sorry, could you start out by saying the Federal Farm Board? Just identify that.
Sure. The Federal Farm Board was an emergency measure. I think that President Hoover was under, and his administration, under great pressure to do something because the farm population was suffering along with city people, but probably more severely. And so he set up a farm board in precisely, in my opinion, the wrong fashion. He named to the board outstanding representatives of what we've come to call agribusiness. The one on it that I remember and knew something about was a man named Schilling of Minnesota, who was a very large dairyman and had little relation to the problems of the average dairy farmer. And the money was spent, I can't recall just how, but it was generally understood that the whole measure did not directly affect the needs of the working farmers of the country. And as soon as the Roosevelt administration was elected shortly after, they just forgot about the farm board and so on.
Okay, thanks. Let's cut for a second. So could you describe to me that area of the country?
Well, as you know,
I'm sorry, sir, I was not set. Go ahead.
Just start. Not ready. You can start any time.
oh, well, as you know, in that winter of 1931, I started a national survey with one other person, Harold Ware was his name, and we slowly went through the South, stopping in all kinds of places, and saw the cotton fields, although, of course, that wasn't cotton picking season, just the stalks were there. Got into some of the sharecropper homes, noted that in these homes it was really quite moving to see. They would use slick paper from magazines like the Saturday Evening Post to cover up the cracks in the wall, keep the wind out. You might see pictures of a well-dressed woman, and but as you would go into one of these homes, from the outside, there were no windows, and you take some time your eyes to become accustomed, and the first thing you'd see is some faces of children. They were there, and you would begin to realize that you were in a home in which there were almost no facilities that you could really call home-like. And outside one of these, I was shown rather proudly the family cow. But the cow was the smallest cow I ever saw. I could tower above it and put my hand down on it, about twice the size of a goat, I'd say, and with an udder, maybe 6 inches across. That was the source of the milk for that family, and it gave about a cup a day when it was fresh, short part of the year. a very valuable addition to their, this is the level. So we went on to the area that we had heard about, England, Arkansas. And as we entered town, I saw 4 or 5 men in overalls with brooms sweeping the main street and for all the world making a spectacle of themselves. And we inquired and found out that these men had to sweep such horse manure as was on the streets as a requirement before the Red Cross would consider giving them anything. And so we went in to see the Red Cross man.
So, Mr. Harris, could you describe how you first arrived, what you saw when you first arrived in England?
I think so. We had looked forward to coming to England, Arkansas, because we'd heard of what had taken place there. So when we pulled into town, first thing I noticed was a big sign, the Bank of England, Arkansas. Then I saw 4 men out on the street with brooms in their hands, new brooms, not used very much, who were sweeping such horse manure as might be on the street. And we inquired and found out that it was done by, required by the Red Cross before they would even consider you eligible for relief, which we, Harold Ware and I, who was my companion, discussed this a bit. Then we decided to go out in the country and see the person who had become a little bit famous there. His name was H.C. Coney, a cash tenant who lived maybe 5-6 miles from England, Arkansas. And we drove up to his rather unpainted house. Looked to me as if the outside boards were pretty far apart. And when we went inside, we saw that he too, like the sharecroppers we'd seen in Alabama, were had used paper to cover up the cracks, but the floorboards showed cracks and you could see the ground underneath them. And of course that made it pretty drafty, and it can be cold in the winter there. Coney welcomed us, and we immediately told him why we'd come. He says, "I'd be very glad to tell you what happened." I looked around the room, and I saw 2 books. One was a Bible, the other was a geography book. And I particularly noticed a kind of a dim representation of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper up over his fireplace. And hanging on a nail was a gasket from a car, kind of covering up part of the picture, but there it was. And Mrs. Coney was there, and some children running around. And we said, "Mr. Coney, we know you went to town and led the farmers to get food. Tell us what happened." "I'd be glad to." And he says, "I was here, and I was in the same condition as about everybody else. And all of a sudden, a woman comes up, and she says, 'Coney, the kids ain't et for 3 days. What'll I do?' And Coney said, 'Something went right up in my head.' And I says, 'You stay here. I'll get food for you.' And I took the woman, he meant his wife, got in the truck, and we went out to somebody's place where the Red Cross was supposed to come, and there were people waiting around there. And I got up and I says to them, we all need food. And if any of you are not yaller, he said, you'll come to town with me now and we'll get food. And they all came. And I filled my truck and other cars joined. And by the time we got to town, we had several hundred cars. And we went to the mayor, and he didn't know what to do. So we went down the main street. And the big grocery store in town was run by a man named Ben High. And we thought that was the right place to go. And we got there, and there's a pretty good man in town named Morris, lawyer Morris. And he got out in front of Ben High's store, and he says, I know what you're here for, and give us a half hour, and there'll be no problem. And Coney said, I got right up on the truck. I wasn't going to hide or crawl under a car or anything. I let everybody see me. And I says, all right, we'll give you the half hour, but we got to have what we came for. And Lawyer Morris says he got on the telephone and he called up Little Rock, Arkansas, the capital, Red Cross. And he says, look, the farmers are in town, hundreds of them. If you don't give us authorization, they're going to take the food. All right, we authorize. So they authorized $2.50 worth of food for everybody. We took it, and we went home. And Coney said then, every 2 weeks after that, we were able to draw $6 worth of food from the Red Cross. Well, when we went back to town, we thought we'd talk to the Red Cross man. So we went up to his office, and he was sitting behind his desk. He was affable and told us what a fine job the Red Cross was doing. And as we were talking, a young farmer in patched overalls came in. He was embarrassed, kind of didn't know how to get started, and the Red Cross guy was ignoring him. So I spoke up and I said, I think this man wants to talk to you. Oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. And the man gave him a piece of paper. And Red Cross guy looked at it. The paper was a prescription slip from a doctor. I saw it afterwards because I saw the man afterwards. And it read, this man's baby is suffering from pneumonia. He requires a bottle of Vicks VapoRub and several other equally small items that I don't recall. Red Cross man looked at it, shook his head, no. He said, we don't give out prescriptions. And the young fella got all red in the face. And I thought he was getting ready to swing. But he turned around and went out. And we interviewed him afterwards. Well, then we went to see Lawyer Morris.
All right, let's cut there for a second. Why was this man embarrassed? Why would the people, was that common for people to be embarrassed? Why?
Possibly I used the wrong word. He was a young father with a family and children. His baby was sick. Maybe he wasn't embarrassed. First place, he was embarrassed to ask for help. But in the second place, the refusal, in so heartless a manner, made him visibly angry. That's why I thought he might take a swing at the Red Cross man. And all red in the face, he went out. Understand? Mm-hmm. I sure could understand.
Okay, let's cut for a second. That was good. What effect did the England food riot and what you saw in the South have on you?
Well, the word riot was commonly used, but there was no riot. As Lawyer Morris said to us emphatically, everything was quiet and dignified, and no one was threatened or hurt. But it was a demonstration that carried an insistent demand, which was heard. And the proof of that is that just a few days after this event, on separate occasions in the United States Senate, old Hattie Caraway, senator from Arkansas, and Robinson, Senator Robinson from Arkansas, national figures, both of them, were up on the floor of the Senate and referring to England, Arkansas, stating the farmers had arrived, and it's time for the Red Cross to really concern itself with the conditions of the people there. So that I was always impressed how one, in itself, small incident could affect the whole nation.
Okay, let's cut.
Past the buck time. It's Harry Truman time.
Could you go over that story that H.C. Coney told you before? Would you tell me again, please?
Well, when we met Coney, I immediately knew that I was dealing with an exceptional person, because there was no hesitation. He says, I'll be very glad to tell you what happened, every detail of it. And so he told me how he was at home one day, and things were pretty rough. They didn't have much food in the house. And a woman, a neighbor of his, came, and she was crying. And she says, Coney, my kids ate Ed for 3 days. What'll I do? Coney said, something went right up in my head. And I said, you're going to get food. And I took the wife, and we got on board the truck, and we drove over to a neighbor's house where the Red Cross was supposed to operate, and there were people hanging around there waiting. And I got up in the truck, and I said, listen to me. We shouldn't wait any longer. We're hungry. If you aren't yaller, come with me, and we'll go to town and we'll get food. And they all came with me. And we filled the truck, and there were a few more trucks, and quite a crowd. We all came to town. And by the time we got to town, there were a couple of hundred of us. And we went to the mayor. The mayor didn't know what to do or say. So we left him, and we went right down the main street, and there's a big grocery store there run by Ben High. And we passed a smaller store on the way. And the guy who ran that store, he got all excited, and he yelled to his clerks, let them take what they want, keep the cash register. And he collapsed. And when he came to, he said, I'll give $1,000. And Coney says, I know it's true, because somebody heard him say it and told me. But they didn't stop there. They went to Ben High's grocery store. Well, lawyer...
Okay, we have to change the focal length, okay? But Coney didn't stop there?
No.
Could you start by saying that? But Coney didn't stop there?
No. But Coney didn't stop there. He and the whole crowd went to the big store, Ben High's place. And there was a man in town named Morris, Lawyer Morris. And he knew what was going on. And he got right out in front of in front of Ben High's store. And he said, listen, I know what you want. I'm for you. But give me a half hour, and we'll do it legal. So Coney told me, I got right up on the truck, I wasn't going to hide. I went right where everybody could see me. Didn't crawl under the car or anything like that. I said, we'll give you the time. We'll wait. And Morris went to the telephone, called up Little Rock, Red Cross there, headquarters of the state, and said, look, the farmers have arrived. They got to have food. You better authorize it right now or they'll take it. So they authorized, and every farmer got $2.50 worth of groceries, and they went home with it. Coney says, and since then, all of us who needs it, we've come down, and every 2 weeks we get $6 worth, and kept us going till the next crop.
That's great. Sweet. Please tell me that story about visiting the Red Cross worker.
Sure. After we left Coney, we decided we'd have a talk with the Red Cross representative in town. So we went to his office. He was there behind a desk, received us very affably, and gave us to understand that the Red Cross was doing wonders. And as we were talking with him, a young farmer came in and stood there waiting to speak to the Red Cross man, but he was being ignored. So I spoke up and said, look, I think he wants your attention. And so only then he said, yes, what is it? And the farmer gave him a piece of paper and stood there. And I later saw the paper. It was a prescription from the doctor saying this man's baby has pneumonia and urgently needs a bottle of Vicks VapoRub and certain other things, just very small things. Red Cross man looked at it. No, we don't give out prescriptions. Passed it back to the thing. Farmer, young father, stood there, all flushed. At first I could see he was embarrassed by asking for help, but then I saw he was visibly angry. I thought maybe he was going to swing at the guy, but he didn't. He turned around and went out. Short enough.
Perfect. I'm going to close there. Is how it affects your own personal psyche, you know, how it changes you as a person. Did it change you?
This was a brand new experience for me. As I said before, I had never seen poverty with this character before. And I also was witnessing racism in a violent way against the black farmers who were in the same situation. So that I guess for the first time in my life, I was convinced that these were problems so enormous. There was something I wanted to find some way of doing something about it. I wanted to make my life impinge on it. It was probably the Coney incident and some of the scenes in the Deep South I saw that had this effect on me.
Great, thank you. What did you realize about it? You decided to do something about it. What was the essence of what you wanted to do?
Well, at that time I didn't know. At that stage was just finding out what the facts of life were. And it was only later that I found the area that I could function best in, and that was working with farmers, as I did in Minnesota and out from Washington. And that was the medium that this all led to.
Was this? Sorry, that preamble. What was wrong, in your opinion, with the way the Red Cross was giving aid? Did you think they were doing bad with it?
Yes, I thought they were giving the absolute minimum that they possibly could, and it was only events like the England-Arkansas March that caused any real loosening.
Could you start again and say the Red Cross? I thought the...
Pardon?
Could you start again and say the Red Cross?
Yeah.
Could you start out with the Red Cross? I thought the Red Cross, or just name it as an organization. So, let's cut for a second. Can't sort of. So I'm just going to ask you this question again, and then we'll go on to the Red Cross thing. So, what did the England food riot really mean?
Well, you know, I think President Hoover was the author of the phrase used in those years, rugged individualism, as the ideal. Well, that's all right. In pioneer days, rugged individuals opened the country. But here was a situation in which whole groups, whole community had to get into action and proved itself extremely effective without the people knowing that they would be so effective. That was a big change.
That these people had grouped together.
That's right, as opposed to solving it yourself by working a little harder or planting a little more or so on.
Well, let's cut for a second. You could put those thoughts in whatever package you want. What did the England food riot really mean?
It meant a great deal. Prior to that time, the slogan that you heard everywhere, I think originating with President Hoover, was rugged individualism. That'll solve everything. That wouldn't solve the situation that existed in England, Arkansas area and all through that southern area. It required a small but effective uprising of people whom everyone could recognize were demanding what was their due. And it did change things, had an enormous national effect. That was something new.
That was great. That was just wonderful. What was the press? There was a big press reaction. What was that all about?
Well, I was still traveling through, and I didn't see much of it. I wrote up what had happened. It was published in the New Republic. I was glad to see and saw that the $26 that they paid me was sent to Coney, and that he wrote me a letter, warmly appreciated it because he needed money bad. And he said that he heard from maybe 25 other people around the country, and some of them sent money. He got over $100 from them. Pleased him mightily. $100 went a long ways in those days.
That's great. That was wonderful. That's the response I was looking for. Oh God, I'm confused now. Why was Coney's action perceived as un-American or communistic?
Yeah, I think it was only so perceived by local people who felt, as one man said, Coney quoted him, "You've done $1 million of damage to this community," and they suspected that there was big political motivation. The only motivation was hunger and personal needs shared by the whole community.
Okay, that was great. I wanted to ask you, who are these people who showed up at that? What kind of people are these that showed up at that store in England, Arkansas on January 3rd? Who were they?
They were a mixture of tenants, both cash tenants, share tenants, and even very small farm owners, all of whom were running hungry. So they were the kind of people you can thoroughly respect, but they were in deep trouble. And as they knew well, and I guess everybody knows, it wasn't their fault.
I'd love for you to give me
Second
a description of H.C. Coney. Who was? Can you please describe H.C. Coney to me?
I'm not sure I can. My memory doesn't distinguish him in appearance from others. Plain guy, wearing rough clothes, sparkling face, and quite able to laugh. And I had for some reason I had a football along with us, and I saw his kids half grown running around, and I got it out of the car and said, would you mind if I gave this to your son? Oh, he said he'd love it. He'll kick hell out of it. So I did, and it's the kind of guy he was. No pretenses.
Open.
Wide open.
Could you say he was a wide open guy? Could you say that H.C. Coney was a wide open guy?
Yes. He,
Could you, just by saying his name so that he's...
well, the best description of H.C. Coney is that he was wide open. He said exactly what he thought. He told exactly what had happened. He didn't care what happened to him. He just believed what he had done was right. His wife backed him up, and I didn't have to ask him twice to tell me the story.
What happened to him afterwards?
Well, I heard from him. I corresponded with him. And come the next season, planting time, he, along with most of the other tenants and farmers there, applied for loans to put in a crop, and had to go through channels. And he noticed that everybody around him was getting their loan, and he wasn't. So he made inquiry. And he was told, well, we didn't get it. So he went to the headquarters at the county seat somewhere around there to find out. Oh, yes, it came through. You were authorized. We turned it down. Well, what'd you do that for? He says, you've done $1 million worth of damage to this community. That's why we turned it down. Well, he says, I'll do something about that. And he went back. Then he went to the local bank where it's supposed to go through, and went several times, raised all the hell he could, and he finally got his loan. Well, then another little incident happened. An appeal was made to give food. Well, he was a farmer, and he says, my wife and I, we made a nice package. He said, they didn't have to ask us twice, he says. And we tied a string around this, put nice things in it. She put in 12 jars of food that she'd can. And it was real nice. And we wrapped it up, put on it from H.C. Coney, and turned it in. A little while later, we went to the headquarters where they were handling this, and looked around for our package. Wasn't there. I inquired. Oh, they said, we saw your name on it. We took that off immediately. We're going to have you get any glory, we can tell you that.
And he...
No, I've forgotten it.
Oh, it's all right. Let's move on to something else, okay? Yeah, and just because it's a very good, in my opinion, it's a very accurate nutshell of what the system's like. So go ahead, sir.
Well, my survey was the whole Deep South, and
Excuse me, sir. Could you just start that one more time? Go ahead.
my survey was of the whole of the Deep South, and I didn't. I couldn't make this same remark as truthfully about the England-Arkansas situation, because as far as I observed, there were very few black population there. But I had just come through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, where, of course, there's a very heavy black population. And it did seem to me that the conditions of life in which the sharecroppers, share tenants, and working hands lived and worked was really scarcely different from the conditions I've read about under slavery. These people were living on almost no cash and were constantly in debt to the landlord, and he could put them out at any time, and lynching was not uncommon. I encountered one case of that a landlord told me about. So I think one can say that at that time, the condition of black people working in the South was akin to slavery, not much advance.
What about for white sharecroppers?
That was pure poverty and hunger.
5, right?
65.
I'd like to go back to this point about what the conditions were like for white sharecroppers, tenant farmers. What was it like?
Well, of course, we met and talked with quite a few white tenant farmers as well as black. And as far as living conditions were concerned, identical. The houses they lived in, their speech, their problems, all of them were suffering from some form of hunger. There's no joke that pellagra was widespread, that disease of malnutrition. So the poor whites, and that's most of the small farmers of the South in those days, were in as serious a fix as the blacks. The only advantage they had, as one guy says, I'm not black.
Who had the power?
Well, the most significant, prominent people in the community were the owners of big plantations, like pre-Civil War. And they had tenants instead of slaves. I don't know how much, they didn't have much political power. That resided in the cities and the big centers. But they were carrying on the old traditions. And some of the old traditions were pretty nasty. If you wish, I can tell you one such incident.
Is that the story about the plantation?
Yeah.
Is it? Tell me about it.
Well, we drove up to a sizable plantation. It had the standard white painted large house on a hill overlooking the farmlands all around it. And the owner was sitting out on the front porch, kind of a veranda, and with white columns around, of course. And he greeted us. Sure, love to talk with you. Says, you came at the right time. The missus and her girlfriends are inside there. It's much more pleasanter here. Sit right down. We didn't comment on that. And a little small talk and a nice cool drink. And we could look down out there in the fields and we could see what he called his hands working in the fields. All of them were black. And I think just to pass the time and tell us what was commonplace around there, he said, you know, we had a little incident here just a week or so ago. White man got into a argument with a nigger. And I knew what was coming. So I sent word to all my hands not to sleep in their homes that night. Come up and sleep in my shed out there. And they did. Men, women, children, all of them, all piled in there. They knew too. And so he said, you know how the boys are when they get excited. They came to the house of the person who had the argument. It was all over a storage battery. who owned it or something, all over a battery. And they came to the house of the black fellow, and he wasn't there. He had sense enough not to be there. His brother was there. He says, you know how the boys are when they get excited. They took the brother, killed him. This was just to pass the time and tell us what was commonplace in those days.
Okay, that's good. Mr. Harris, how did you find out about the bonus march?
Well, I was in Washington and preparing for a farmers' conference that, by pure chance, was coming to Washington in December of that year. That would be 1932, 31, 32, 32. And to my surprise, at the very same time, the unemployed staged a march into Washington that December, and the bonus Army vets from World War I, the bonus march, came to Washington of I don't know how many thousand veterans demanding that the bonus that had been voted by Congress and never paid should be paid, amounting to, in those days, quite a large sum, $600. And they came for that. And they organized a camp, and I was interested because one of my close friends, whose name was Otto Anstrom, a North Dakota farmer and a veteran of World War I, he was part of the march. I saw him, and he said, come on over, I'd like to show you Camp Anacostia. I did. And it was organized in military fashion. After all, they were all veterans. Streets were lined, everything clean, tents put up, straight line and so forth, latrines where they ought to be, so on. And Otto even told me that he rather enjoyed when he was in the latrine, and was big enough to have more than one, he'd tell some outrageous story. Then he'd go back and wait. Take about a half hour for that story to get back to him from somebody else. He'd get around the camp real fast. So they were disciplined, visited congressmen, and so forth. And in one instance, they occupied a abandoned house, federal building. It was abandoned. And this went on for quite a long while, at least 3, 4, 6 weeks maybe. Finally, the administration, President Hoover, ordered them to abandon that house. Federal property can't be there. They refused. Then he issued an order for them to leave town. Well, they didn't pay attention to that. Then he sent for the troops. And it, I think, is of interest that leading a group of cavalry and a couple of not too formidable whippet tanks came down the avenue in front of this Camp Anacostia. And in command was General MacArthur.
Okay, let me just, what I'd like you to do, let's cut.
Okay,
so can you tell me what you witnessed that day?
yes. It was the day that the Army was called out, and I wanted to see it. So it was not easy to get close to Camp Anacostia at that time, but I had a press card and used it and got through police lines and viewed the advance of some cavalry and a couple of not too formidable looking whippet tanks, just in case. And I was interested to note that the commander of this Army contingent was General MacArthur, the General MacArthur, and that there were 2 majors present. One of them was Major George Patton.
Okay, why don't we start out? Let's cut for a second. Yeah. What about sound? You all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me what you witnessed on that day. It was July 28th, 1932.
of course, I was aware that a big event was occurring, and I wanted to see it. So I had a press card, and I used it to get through the police line, which would otherwise have blocked me off. And I was standing in front, on the highway in front of Camp Anacostia, where the bonus camp was. And I saw advancing towards us a Army contingent consisting of some cavalry, some marching troops, a couple of not too formidable whippet tanks, whose purpose wasn't too clear to me. And they marched down and formed a military stand in front of the camp. And I suddenly realized that the commander was the Chief of Staff of the United States at the time, General MacArthur, and that assisting him were two majors who were later to become extremely famous. One was George Patton, Major George Patton then, and the other was Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, who participated in this affair. And of course, after a certain delay and certain demands and certain refusals on the part of the occupants of the camp, the order was given to march forward with tear gas and drive the bonus men from the camp. Well, I wasn't present for that, but my friend Otto Anstrom, the North Dakota farmer veteran, was present and described very graphically how the men who had been under fire in Europe, and this was nothing new to them, kept the proper distance, and when a canister of tear gas would be thrown, part of the time they'd throw it back because not everybody of the troops had gas masks, and that caused a fair amount of commotion. But they, of course, gave way as the men with their fixed bayonets moved forward. And then, when they got to the center camp, they busily went to work burning up the tents, and all the equipment was in it. And I had a perfect personal feeling because I had lent to Anstrom.
Okay, we gotta hold the line.
Okay.
So, describe to me how you moved into Washington, please.
Well, after I completed the farm survey, we decided to set up a little office in Washington. We called it Farm Research Incorporated. And pretty soon, many of the places we had visited on our tour were planning to send delegates to Washington to petition the government for relief and other necessary things. And since I was there and had met them, I was asked to prepare the conference, which I did. And so about 300 farmers gathered in Washington on December 7th of 1931. Yes. And
Oh, wait a second. I think that might be the end of the year conference, the 30. Sorry, let's cut for a second. I would have talked to you about it before a little bit more.
Okay.
But what happened for you in December of 1931?
well, when I completed my farm tour, I came to Washington, and several of us with Harold Ware participating set up an office which we called Farm Research. And we began to put out a little paper out to the farm communities where we had just been. And pretty soon we realized that there was preparations going on out there to form a march and come to Washington. And
Let's cut.
What I wanted to ask you about, sir, is the sense of mounting pressure in Washington. And what I'd like you to do is start out by saying when you moved there and what you were doing there, and then what you witnessed in terms of the mounting pressure. So would you describe that?
I think I arrived in Washington mid or late 1931, and I set up there in order to coordinate a growing farm movement. I wasn't aware then that this was the beginning of really a very unique and historical moment, because though I was busy contacting many of the farms and farm groups I had met on the survey, but at the same time, the unemployed were becoming more and more restless and planning a march into Washington. And the veterans of World War I, who had been promised a bonus, were decided the only way they'd get it was by coming to Washington and demanding it. And a large number of veterans marched in and set up Camp Anacostia. So with this confluence of farmer, unemployed labor, and veterans, a very unique situation had developed in Washington, and the pressure on the administration was considerable.
That's great. Thank you. Can you
hear that noise?
Yeah, is it on the tape? Could you describe the Hoovervilles that you saw?
The Hooverville that I remember most clearly was in California at the confluence of the two rivers, the San Joaquin and the Sacramento. And there's along the banks a series of little shacks, and one guy in particular we talked with was a watchmaker, and he had all his tools and equipment with him, but no job. And just over here, within sight of where this Hooverville was a warehouse, and outside the warehouse was a great pyramid of rotting beans. And two men had sort of climbed up on these rotting beans. They'd poured used cylinder oil over it to keep it from smelling, and they were digging in, trying to find some beans that were edible beyond where the cylinder oil had gotten. That was the Hooverville that I witnessed.
So, who were these people in the Hoovervilles?
I only know the watchmaker. The rest of them were down and out people who had no job and were just living in these shacks they put together with nothing, just boards, and waiting for things to change.
Could you tell me your sleeping bag story? I mean, how did you feel about the rout of the vets? Anything about it bother you?
Well, I wasn't present when they actually burned down the camp, but my friend Otto Anstrom, the North Dakota veteran and farmer who was there, gave me the whole picture, because he was part of the group that stood there in defiance of the soldiers that were marching, and he invited me to come and see the camp after it had burned down. And I said, by the way, Otto, I loaned you my Abercrombie and Fitch sleeping bag, very expensive sleeping bag. Where is it? He laughed, biggest joke in the world. He says, by order of the President of the United States, it's been burnt to a crisp. Well, I said, that doesn't make me love the President any too much. And it is true that my sleeping bag and his clothing and the tents and so forth and the people's possessions, what little they had there, were all burnt down and destroyed.
That's great. Now, you'd seen all this stuff. You'd seen England, 1931. You'd seen the farmers come to Washington. You'd seen the unemployed marches. You'd seen the bonus people coming in. What did all this mean?
Well, it meant that the people had come to a state in which they required some kind of action. And of course, this was followed by many other developments, not least of which was the laborers organizing with the unorganized under John L. Lewis and the CIO. And so I think we can say that what occurred in 1931 was the beginning of widespread popular movements, and then, of course, the Roosevelt administration recognized and did something about it. And today, when I compare in particular, the rise in dignity and considerable political power of the black people of America, the contrast with the state of the sharecroppers then, and the many cities and congressmen and other political offices that black people now occupy, shows that America really has advanced quite a bit. But there's plenty more to do.
Now, you changed your political orientation at the beginning of 1932. Why?
I guess it was the first time I was aware of the extent of the social problem confronting my country. And so it gripped me, and I've been involved in various aspects of the farm movement ever since. And if you care to read about it, I've written it all up in my book entitled My Tale of Two Worlds, being my experiences in the Soviet Union and in this country, mostly having to do with rural agricultural affairs.
What does your heart say about this period of time, this period of ending with the defeat of Herbert Hoover?
Well, it's exciting. It tells me that in the end, there is such a thing as people's power. And I've always believed it, and now I'm sure of it. We need a little of that today, I would say. We have a few problems today that I know about, like the inner cities and the farmers. Once more in trouble.
What happened to him as a person?
I thought he would become, at that point, a pathetic figure. When Philip Smith of Pennsylvania, one of our farmer delegates, himself a Quaker also, interviewed him very gently and so forth, Herbert Hoover said, "There's nothing I can do. And the power has been taken from me." And he looked sort of crumpled. And he went out of office a disappointed man.
Did you want Herbert Hoover to win?
Pardon me?
Did you want Herbert Hoover to win that election?
Oh, no.
Why?
I felt that he was not he was not trying to solve any problems except by methods like the Farm Board that helped the upper level and not the people who were really suffering. I thought he had the wrong approach.
Is that all right?
No, we just have that on
I
sound.
think you should ask that again if you want.
I'll take it voiceover. Unemployed marches. You'd seen the bonus march. Had Herbert Hoover listened?
I really don't think so. He was caught by surprise. Everyone, I think, remembers his speech in which he said, "A chicken in every pot and a car in every garage." And then wham, came the 1929 crash, caught him entirely by surprise, and most of the country. So when our delegation met him, he seemed just helpless. I even felt sorry for him. And he pretty soon disappeared from the scene. And these forces that I saw developing, coming from the heart of America, the unemployed who are workers, who used to be in the factories and so on, farmers who used to have real farms and were in danger of losing them, and the bonus marchers who were veterans of World War I, each a big segment of the country's population all were rising up and making their feelings and demands felt, and it really did usher in a new state of affairs, which the Roosevelt, in its due course and due time, took advantage of.
Hoover's what?
Name.
What Herbert Hoover's? Do you think Herbert Hoover had a tragic flaw?
What?
Do you think Herbert Hoover had a tragic flaw?
Well, I don't think he was as humane as he was pictured. After all, he was the food administrator during the war, and he was known as the great engineer. And when more facts were known, he was a pretty ruthless person. And that, in my opinion, is a serious flaw for a president of the United States. And so he wasn't sensitive to what was happening. And he lost out.